hesitation, George asked Grafton's Chancellor of the Exchequer, Lord Frederick North, the member for Banbury, to form a government. North has gone down in history as the worst Prime Minister of all time, the man who lost America. Although few premiers have been more unfortunate than North, there have been many who have been far less able. In fact, North was much more Louise's sister. It was one of the first examples of her gunboat diplomacy. Although George felt sorry for Caroline, she was a disgraced and dishonoured woman who could not return to the English court. She retired to the castle of Zell in Hanover and died there on the 10th of May, 1775, aged 23. These were heavy blows, but George was strong enough to take them. Away from St. James's, domestic life was pleasantly informal. In the summer of 1775, George and Charlotte stayed at the White House, since demolished, in what is now Kew Gardens. King and Queen got up at 6 and spent 2 hours alone before breakfasting with their elder children. George believed in exercise, plenty of air, and a simple, almost vegetarian diet. At Kew, he went for long walks, occasionally played on a harpsichord, once owned by Handel, enjoyed a game of backgammon with his equerries, or prayed alone in a small chapel with a prayer book in which all references to our most religious and gracious king was struck out and replaced with the words, "a most miserable sinner." George never conformed to the picture of the hard-drinking, overeating, corpulent Englishman, supposedly typical of the time. He had a very modern horror of overweight. Obesity ran in his family, and as a young man he resolved never to become the size of his huge uncles. In fact, the king preserved a youthful figure well into middle age. Between breakfast and dinner, he usually ate only 1 slice of bread and butter and a dish of black tea. After his illness in 1765, George enjoyed excellent health for over 20 years. Even in bad weather, he thought nothing of riding from Windsor to London Royalists. He was well disposed and gave generously to a fund for building a German Protestant church in London. Through religion, the king became interested in education and looked forward to the day when every poor child in the country would be able to read his Bible. At a time when many regarded popular education as dangerous, George gave it his steady support. Even if he was not really interested, he was able to talk to his subjects about advances in science, the condition of the Presbyterian clergy, poetry, book collecting, astronomy, everything under the sun, with at least a smattering of knowledge. In short, in day-to-day life, George III was a splendid king who behaved much better than his brother monarchs. Sir Robert Murray, who was presented to Louis XVI at Fontainebleau in November 1774, declared, "The king receives presentations with less attention than one naturally shows to a cat." I doubt if there is a king of Negres or a Khan of Tartar so ridiculously uncivil. For us, who know our own king, who would speak civilly to even a French captain, how strange must this appear? Even those who disliked George's policies admitted his good points. Benjamin Franklin, who visited London during the riots of May 1768, commented, "Some punishment seems preparing for a people who are so ungratefully abusing the best constitution and the best king any nation was ever blessed with." Punishment was coming, but George was to suffer from it as much as any of his ungrateful people. The first half of the 1770s may have been quiet in England, but in America there were increasing signs of trouble. The king was still popular, and as late as was enough to end the boycott of British goods in all colonies except Massachusetts. In the early 1770s, George received a number of petitions from the colonies protesting against the tax and against the behaviour of many of its representatives in North America. Even if he had favoured the petitions, George had no choice but to submit them to the Privy Council and accept the opinion of that body. A petition against the Governor of Massachusetts was heard at the Cockpit in Whitehall on the 29th of January 1774. The petitioners were represented by Benjamin Franklin, the agent of the American colonies in Britain. Franklin, who had hitherto been pro-British, was viciously attacked and humiliated by the Solicitor General Alexander Wedderburn. The council advised the king that the petition was groundless, vexatious and scandalous, and recommended Franklin's dismissal as Deputy Paymaster General for America. The Americans did more than petition. In December 1773, a tea ship belonging to the East India Company was attacked in Boston Harbour by a large number of citizens, some so unwilling to compromise their official positions that they disguised themselves as Mohawk Indians. At the Boston Tea Party, a cargo worth £18,000 was destroyed. Although the Americans were being taxed without their consent, the duty on tea was only 3 pence per pound. appreciation of the virtues of aristocracy, loyalty to the crown, military prowess, territorial influence, the respect of other sections of society, and leadership in all the arts of civilization. If the House of Lords and their relations in the Commons gave North large majorities, then the Prime Minister must be right. That was the order of nature. Benjamin Franklin's rejection of the caste superiority claimed by Parliament and an indirect assertion of the need for a reform of the representative system would have filled George with horror. So long as the war was going reasonably well, there were few in any section of society who gave much thought to the abstract justice of the American cause. Pleas for conciliation from Chatham and Rockingham fell on deaf ears. The king was far more in tune with the mood of the nation when he described the Americans as an unhappy, misled, deluded multitude. Attempts were still made at compromise, but the demand in America for complete separation from Britain was increasing. For some time there was great reluctance to blame George, and the British forces were described as the parliamentary, not the royal armies. Only after the Declaration of Independence issued by Congress on the 4th of July 1776 was it necessary to depict the king as a tyrant. Recent statues and pictures were smashed to pieces. The British troops fought extremely well and were generally supported by the native American population, who feared that with independence their territories would be taken away far more ruthlessly than under the British. Despite Native American support, however, the British commanders seemed unable to follow up their victories. Lord North began to doubt their competence. I do not know whether our generals will frighten the enemy, but I know they frighten me whenever I think of them. The news of the failure of an attempt to invade New York from Canada and Burgoyne's surrender came as a tremendous blow. George was very upset, but according to Horace Walpole, tried to disguise his concern by laughing and being so indecently merry that Lord North had to stop him. The disaster had an important effect on politics. The country gentlemen began to complain that the war was very expensive without producing any tangible results. Even worse, Saratoga gave France an excuse to recognise the colonies as an independent state, receive Franklin at Versailles, and negotiate an alliance with him. The war in America was a splendid opportunity for France to smash the maritime and colonial superiority which Britain had established in the 7 Years' War. Much of the British Navy was engaged in operations off the east coast of America. The Channel was very vulnerable. The king sent James Hutton to Paris in a last attempt to get terms from Franklin. It was clear that there would be increasing pressure to give the Americans peace at any price in order to concentrate on an enemy nearer at home. After 7 years as Premier, North had become weary. He wanted to obtain peace with the rebels and then retire. In February 1778, he offered the Americans any terms short of actual independence, but independence had become a fact, and the suggestion was poorly received. George would not allow the Prime Minister to retire, and begged North not to follow Grafton's example Chatham should become Prime Minister, North himself urged the king to send for a man who was probably the greatest war leader in British history. George would not hear of this suggestion. Despite his sense of national duty, he would not give office to a man he considered had betrayed him. The king had been kind and tolerant when Chatham was ill, and the Earl owed his peerage and a pension of £5,000 per year to George's favour. Chatham's inflammatory speeches attacking North and vindicating his rebels had made him the trumpet of sedition, ready to go to the edge of treason to destroy his political enemies. George would probably have been forced to come to terms with Chatham, but the great statesman had a stroke in the House of Lords and died on the 11th of May 1778. The king was displeased when Parliament voted that Chatham, the last remaining great figure from George II's reign, should have a public funeral in Westminster Abbey. The setbacks to North's American policy gave new hope to the opposition, particularly to the Whig grandees. The Earl of Chatham had been too much of an individualist to be completely acceptable either to the crown or to the great families. After Chatham's death, the spiritual heirs of the Duke of Newcastle sought to regain their hegemony. George was a healthy man of 40, and there was no prospect of another reign in the foreseeable future. There was no point in opposition, members pinning their hopes on sympathetic members of the royal family. The only way they could obtain the offices which they regarded as theirs by right was to oppose the king and Lord North on points of principle, defeat the government in Parliament, and compel George to give them what they wanted. The Whig grandees were prepared to go to extreme lengths and use popular discontent, which could very easily recoil, to achieve their aims, as they no longer enjoyed lucrative sinecure places. They began to argue that these appointments were evil, and the means by which the king exercised undesirable influence over Parliament. On the 8th of February 1718, Sir George Savile presented the Yorkshire petition urging the abolition of sinecures. War with the American colonies disrupted trade, and merchants claimed that they had difficulty in finding the money to pay their taxes. Some of the proceeds of this taxation went into the pockets of men who gave the country nothing in return. The time had come for drastic reductions. The Whigs secured the services of the great Irish orator Edmund Burke. On the 11th of February 1780, Burke introduced his plan of economical reform, in which he attacked the influence of the crown as having taken away vigour from arms, wisdom from government, and every shadow of credit from kingship. Although Burke's plan was defeated later that year, John Dunning's motion that the influence of the crown has increased, is increasing, and ought to be diminished, was carried by a majority of 18. It was a clear sign that the tide was turning against North. In many ways, the strategy employed by Rockingham and his followers was masterly. The country gentlemen and merchants had a real interest in abolishing sinecures and reducing taxation. decision might be embarrassing.